for his work on pattern and scale, and more recently for his research at the interface between ecology and economics. There's a mouthful. Especially problems of public goods, common pool resources, and the global commons. His book, Fragile Dominion, along with his subsequent research, weaves these themes together, invoking ecological and evolutionary theory to inform principles for management practice. He began his education with a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Johns Hopkins, followed by a PhD in mathematics from the University of Maryland, postdoctoral research at University of California, Berkeley, then led to an academic appointment at Cornell, where he rose to Charles A. Alexander Professor and director of several centers and programs there. That was followed by a move to Princeton, where he is now the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Throughout his work, a central thread has been the development of rules for scaling from the microscopic to the macroscopic, from individuals to collectives, from small scales to larger scales, and from short time scales to long. He has won 6 major international prizes, including the National Medal of Science in 2014, awarded in 2016. He's a member of 5 major honorary societies, has 12 major society awards, and 5 honorary degrees. Well, I could go on, but I think I should turn the floor over to Professor Levin, who will speak to us about public goods from biofilms to societies. Thank you so much, Simon, for helping us celebrate Science Week.
Thank you very much, David. First of all, I want to thank the various funding sources that have helped me over the years. From microbial systems to socioeconomic systems, we see macroscopic patterns emerging from microscopic interactions, all the way from things like the cellular slime molds, which have been subjects of research in mathematical biology for many decades, to large animal aggregations like these wildebeest herds, in which the broad-scale patterns emerge from local interactions, fantastic patterns on the front. And there are possible benefits for all. This picture just appeared in New Scientist a couple of weeks ago. These are all individual starlings which band together to a large extent, in this case, to foil predators, and by looking like a giant starling, there's obviously some collective benefit to them. That's a public good. Why do individuals engage in this in ways that will benefit that collective good? This inescapably leads to conflicts between levels. Like, why do those individuals do the things that are good for the collectives? Tumor cells, for example, are an example of a breakdown of public goods. The rapid growth of the tumor cells is ultimately not good for the organism, but in the short term, the tumor cells replace normal cells, and so they gain. Problems of this sort create challenges for societies, balancing the interests of the individual against the interests of society, and the need to scale, going back to these starlings, and I will show you these in motion here, and I'm hoping there's no sound when I do this, from individuals to ensembles and both. Before I start the video, you can see this, what's so-called murmuration of starlings. Those are all starlings except for that one hawk that you can see perhaps up here in the middle. So let me run. So problems of this sort were some of the things that got me interested in patterns to begin with, because as trained in fluid dynamics, I couldn't help but look at these patterns and wonder, how was it that the individual movements become organized into the broader patterns? So the question that I'll keep coming back to throughout the lecture is, how does such cooperation arise? And can we achieve cooperation at the global level, for example, on climate change, and other environmental problems. And you'll see this question raised over and over again in the lecture because I think it's the fundamental question facing us. How do we achieve cooperation in the collective good? And can we turn to how nature does it? How these small individuals can band together to overwhelm a much larger predator through their collective activities. So let's start at the beginning. Public goods problems are widespread, both in socioeconomic and in ecological context. Everything from this competition between these fishermen and oil rigs that you see on the left, classic examples from economics, to the tumor cells that I already spoke about. This is a termite mound. This is from a paper on which I was part, in which Karina Tarnita my colleague is the senior author. Termite mounds represent collective activities of large numbers of animals that all contribute to something that's in the collective good. But how do we prevent free riding on this? I'll come back to this theme over and over again. Paul Samuelson, the great economist, defined public goods as goods that we all enjoy in common, in the sense that my consumption of it doesn't lead to a subtraction from your consumption of that good. And so in that sense, it distinguishes them from things like fisheries that are common pool resources. But of course, there is a whole continuum between them. And for the purposes of this lecture, I'm just going to lump them together. What I will call public goods are simply goods in which we all benefit, but in which individuals have to, in some sense, make a contribution. Problems of public goods, like renewable resources and common pool resources, are central to the future of humanity. But yet you see that the availability of many of these is going down, obviously through our own activities. We are eroding our public goods through pollution, through overconsumption, through population growth, etc. Furthermore, we live in what's called a global commons, in which individual agents are acting largely in their own self-interest, and the social costs of our activities are not adequately accounted for. This was pointed out strongly by my late and wonderful colleague, Kenneth Arrow, one of the greatest economists ever, who said the problem in addressing environmental problems is that economic markets don't adequately account for the social costs of individual activities. So we need to think of other ways to address these problems. And the real challenge here are these so-called free riders, like this hobo riding on the rails of this train, individuals who reap the benefits of the collective activities, but find ways not to pay the price. So let me go to my roots in ecology for a few minutes. Public goods and common pool resource problems are central in ecology as well. This herd of reindeer that you see on the right and the other examples of collective motion and collective activities in animal populations are examples where the public good is information. And we may not think of that as a public good, but is perhaps the essential public good. I already mentioned tumor cells as a breakdown of a public good problem. In the oceans, the organisms produce things called siderophores, which will lock up things like iron and other elements that are valuable to them. Plants, just like humans, have to share aquifers, share water use. The uptake of water by one plant affects the availability for other plants. So this is a fundamental problem in dealing, very not dissimilar from the problems we face with our limited resources. Plants fix nitrogen in order to convert it into forms that they can use. This may not seem like a public goods problem, but if a plant A drops its leaves after fixing nitrogen on the ground and plant B is next to it, plant B can derive some of the benefits of that without having paid the price of nitrogen fixation. Even bacteria cooperate, and the mechanism by which they cooperate is what gives rise to dental biofilms and keeps our dentists in business. Now, how does this work? Well, the bacteria produce extracellular polymers. Those polymers serve both as signals as matrices for growth, but they're costly to produce. The biofilms are crucial to the success of the bacteria, but it's a real game theoretic challenge to understand under what conditions the bacteria will produce these signals in these extracellular polymers that are crucial for growth. Plants also produce antibiotics. Chemicals, bacteria do the same. Uh, Chemicals, for example, that will poison neighbors and provide some collective advantage. But if I'm a third type that doesn't produce the antibiotic but still manages to maintain resistance to it, I can benefit from what my neighbors do. Now, of course, we're familiar with the problem of antibiotics in a different context because we overuse antibiotics in our societies, not just in medical uses, but in agriculture. And this is causing terrific problems in terms of the breakdown of the effectiveness of our existing antibiotics. If you're interested in this topic, I recommend this wonderful book by Marty Blazer called Missing Microbes, in which he not only documents the overuse of antibiotics, and there are other factors involved here too, but the end result is that our microbiota are much less diverse than those of our ancestors. This is leading to epidemics of things like asthma, gastroesophageal reflux, and other diseases that are the result of the breakdown of our microbiota. There are a number of other factors that are involved in the loss of this. If anybody's interested, we can come back to that in the discussion. And of course, we're all aware of a similar problem that's arising in a different sense, involving things like vaccination and mask wearing in the current COVID crisis, because both vaccination and mask wearing involve public goods problem. You've all heard about herd immunity. If we reach herd immunity, if 80%, let's say, of the population is protected, then others can free ride without bothering to get vaccinated, without bothering to wear masks. So these are public goods problems. Vaccination, even before COVID, was a major public goods problem. The anti-vaccination movement, which has a real base in Texas, has been around for a while, and it's leading to outbreaks in various places of measles, and of course, is a real challenge regarding COVID. One of my students is working on a related problem, which is not vaccine hesitancy, but how people's unwillingness to go visit their doctors and get their shots during this crisis is leading to upticks in measles cases, for example, in New York and elsewhere. One of the interesting factors, and this is something I will come back to in somewhat different context, is that vaccine hesitancy, as well as mask wearing, are socially mediated. Different groups of individuals, you can scan this list here, have different levels of vaccine hesitancy. That doesn't confine the risk to those groups that are most hesitant because these are not contained. I was hopeful a few weeks ago when I saw this article, which pointed out that as this was in the Wall Street Journal, as COVID vaccinations were ramping up and people saw that the side effects were not great, that hesitancy was waning. But then just a few days ago, I saw this article in CNN, and since then, lots of documentation of this, that even though eligibility for vaccines is wide open, demand is dropping. And you've probably seen in the news just in the last 24 hours, the notion that we're no longer really supply limited in terms of the ability to deliver vaccines, but demand limited, and we expect that to change over the next 2 to 4 weeks as most of the people who want to get vaccinated succeed in doing so, leaving the vaccine hesitant or vaccine resistant types. Now, this is the book that David mentioned that I wrote now 20 years ago, in which I developed the thesis that public goods maintenance is essential to the sustainability of our society, building on ideas from 2 centuries ago of William Forster Lloyd, where he talked about the commons, the place where multiple individuals would graze their cattle, but also these would be multiple use ecosystems that where cattle manure might leak into the nearby areas, etc. The idea of the commons then really became developed in a famous paper by Garrett Hardin, in which he talked about the tragedy of the commons. And the reason I say about that this is the tragedy of the unregulated commons, meaning that because it's a game theoretic problem in which, because individuals don't have a sufficient personal incentive to make the contributions to the commons, we may get locked into essentially prisoner's dilemma, or at least in a coordination game, unsatisfactory equilibrium. And the reason I said unregulated is Hardin's solution was what he called mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, but by then he really meant a substantial role for government in maintaining and enforcing this coercion. So it was a revolution some years later when Elinor Ostrom, a late great Nobel laureate in economics, pointed out that cooperation in small societies didn't come from the top down, but it depended upon norms that individuals, for example, fishermen, might develop among themselves and self-regulate. And the role of self-regulation has attracted a lot of attention in a wide variety of contexts, largely influenced by Ostrom's work. As an example, and I won't take you through the mathematics of this, but with 2 of my former students, one a postdoc, Alessandro Tovoni and Maya Schluter, we looked at water withdrawal from aquifers or fish withdrawals from marine situations in which individuals had a choice. They could either withdraw maximizing their own short-term benefits, or they could collectively get together and pretend they were a single individual who wanted to maintain the resource for the future, in which case they would withdraw at a much lower rate because they were interested in sustainability. Now, that's a model for large numbers of our renewable and, of course, non-renewable resources. We need to take a longer time horizon. But in an open access fishery, fishermen are unlikely to do that because their reticence to withdraw, their prudence, is going to be diluted. So we looked at models as to how this might be resolved, stimulated by Ostrom's work, for example, by those who were more future-oriented, banding together, agreeing to withdraw at lower rates, and agreeing to punish in some way, perhaps by ostracism, those who withdrew at the higher rate. And we allowed the more selfish individuals to withdraw at a variety of rates. We built mathematical models to look at this, and the output looks something like this. And what I want you to take away from this is, first of all, the bottom axis is the proportion of the population that are cooperators, that agree to withdraw at the lower rate and punish those who withdraw at the higher rate. And this is how selfish the selfish individuals are. How many times the social optimum they're withdrawing at. And what we find is that this is what's called a coordination game. That is, there's a threshold level given by this line here, so that if the frequency of cooperators is below that line, you collapse and basically the fishery collapse. But if you can get the number of cooperators above a threshold level, you move to a much better equilibrium in which the resource is preserved for the future. Now, this is not so different from international agreements on climate change or any international agreement in which you don't you don't put them into force until a threshold number of nations signs on. It won't work if only a few countries are doing it. So I'll return to that later on. This is what's called a coordination game. It's much different than the prisoner's dilemma, which is what you often hear about. Second example, in work with Avinash Dixit and Dan Rubenstein, is pastoralism in East Africa, this in Kenya, in which herdsmen share grazing grounds so that if, for example, I'm having a bad year in terms of weather conditions, I can go to my neighbor and say, can I send my cattle over to graze on your ground? My neighbor says, why should I do that? And I say, well, next year the situation might be reversed. So we may end up with a beneficial arrangement between us. And this is, in fact, what happens there. There's a sharing of grazing ground. Again, it's a coordination game. And more strongly reinforced by the fact that my son may have married the daughter of my neighbor, and so my neighbor may say, well, I actually feel some pro-sociality towards you. In these herder societies, kinship and pro-sociality can be very important. So these are notions that will come up over and over again. I also will point out that pro-sociality is something that I can actually be selected for. This is work with Avinash Dixit. If I recognize that a pro-social world is a better place for my children to be, I'd be willing to contribute to an education program now, which will instill pro-sociality in future generations. And so we showed that this can work as to why pro-sociality can arise, reinforcing earlier work by people like Herb Guinness and Errol Akche and others. So what have I tried to point out so far? Collective action can be effective if it includes some form of enforcement, which certainly can be bottom up. Pro-sociality is an important contributor, that is caring about others, to the maintenance of public goods and common pool resources. So now I want to turn in the second part to how are collective decisions made. Now, in mathematics, there are a number of theories, and in economics, about what's called voting theory and how best, and of course we're all going through this now in dealing with election laws, how best to represent the interests of the collectives. But I take you back to Thomas Paine, one of the founders of the country, who said we should look at nature for understanding how decisions are made. And so we've been working. I showed at the beginning those videos of bird populations and other animal populations, like the reindeer, the wildebeest. But humans are very similar in this. So what can we learn from looking at other animal populations about collective phenomena and collective decision making in nature? Uh, so this is work with my former postdoc and later colleague Ian Cousin, and Jens Kraus and Nigel Franks. Paper published about 15 years ago, 16 years ago, in Nature, in which we looked at fish populations, both in terms of experiments, giving incentives to fish, and through mathematical modeling. We used simulations to explore these wonderful aggregations of fish schools. Remarkably, where you don't see traffic jams like you do in air traffic. So these sorts of collective phenomena are widespread. And I'll just show you a few videos of those, and also some indication of the sorts of the output of the sort of computer models that we looked at to try to reproduce these sorts of behaviors. Now, Ian was really the key person here, but we've been working on collective phenomena of this sort for a long time. Nature provides fantastic examples of pattern formation, and our question is, can we reproduce these sorts of patterns by building agent-based models in which the agents have rules that tell them how to move, how to pay attention to their neighbors, etc. Now we've seen this for the fish schools that you see on the left there. Um, sorry, for the bird flocks that you've seen, and for the reindeer. Um, what can we learn from nature? Can we build models um, about individual decision making, not just movement? Of course, movement's also important. Um, and the paper in the middle there is some of our effort to do that, to understand how collective decisions are made in human populations. Now, humans, of course, a question that's going to come up is, uh, are aren't humans different than other animals? So for example, we can build models, we have crystal balls, we can make calculations. We should be able to do even better than other species. We should be able to anticipate changes. But the question is, will we? Now, we know that scientific consensus is strong on many core environmental issues like climate change, temperature increase, but we haven't taken the adequate action to address them. And it's not because we don't know what to do in terms of the physics or the biology. Those are not our primary limitations, but rather it's the willingness of people and governments to commit to the common good. It's all the sorts of game theoretic challenges that I've been hinting at in the first half of the lecture. And to how do we cooperate in finding solutions that benefit everyone and which everybody's willing to sign on. For example, this is a somewhat dated study now, but it still holds true. This was a study carried out by Resources for the Future on attitudes towards climate change in different countries. Is the temperature increasing? Have humans affected the temperature increase? Can we do anything to stop it? Um, and should we do anything to stop it? And I could focus on any one of these. They all tell the same story. In China and in Sweden, we get very similar results for different reasons. And about 95% of the people are convinced that climate change is a problem. We ought to do something about it. The US, the number is much lower, 73%. Why? Um, what is the role of the cultural influences here that cause this much lower commitment to these sorts of things? This is a more recent study produced by Yale University and George Mason University. It also tells an interesting story in terms of um, believing and worrying about climate change. In 2008, about 51% of the people were either alarmed or concerned about climate change. In 2010, what had happened? It had dropped to 39%. By 2016, it was back up to about 45%, and today it's back up to about where it was in 2008. Why? What happened? Well, between 2008 and 2010, we had a financial crisis. People's attention turned elsewhere. They said, we'll worry about climate change later. We have to get um, our retirement accounts restocked. We've got to get the economy moving again. Uh, it was in conflict. And uh, therefore, attitudes can change very rapidly, largely due to external events, but it could be due also to endogenous events. There's another interesting study. We've been working on mask wearing uh, during the COVID crisis, and this is a breakdown according to countries. Now, if you look at the countries, anybody who's traveled in China or Japan over the years knows that mask wearing is much more common there during flu epidemics and the like. And so A year ago, the proportion of individuals who were willing to wear masks in China and Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, etc., was very high, and little has changed. In the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, there was no tradition, and there's still no tradition. I have frequent Zoom calls with my colleagues in Sweden, and nobody's wearing masks. And then there are a third set of countries, including the United States, in which the tradition was not there a year ago, but in which the proportion of individuals willing to wear masks has gone up dramatically. Perhaps not to the level of the Asian countries, but still a dramatic change. So, what are the cultural factors? What are the political factors in these countries that account for that? So that's why, as David mentioned, I've turned a lot of these sorts of issues attention to the interface between environmental systems and social systems, because they are so integrally connected to understand how norms change. Social norms are key. This is a paper that we put out a few years ago, not just in understanding why we're having problems, but how we might change and address these issues. Social norms can change rapidly. A paper Paul Ehrlich and I wrote 16 years ago. The most famous example down here was foot binding in China, which was well established for centuries and then disappeared over a very short period of time. In the US, attitudes towards smoking in public places, to racial equality, although I'm less convinced that I was when I made this slide, gender equality, attitudes towards climate change, you've seen attitudes towards issues related to the pandemic, or even if we're having a pandemic, depend very much upon the social group, the cultural group you belong to, the country you live in. The central issues are behavioral and cultural. Um, Emphasis on intergenerational equity, on fairness and intra-generational equity within our times, on how we deal with public goods and common pool resources, on how we get cooperation in the commons, on the role of social norms and the institutions that get established, like cooperative agreements, and how these become eventually made more rigorous in terms of laws, um, and ultimately, how do we develop leadership and develop consensus for dealing with these issues? What do I mean by equity? Well, we discount. We all discount the future. We worry about, and discounting is a fascinating topic, particularly since evidence is we don't discount at a constant rate. I'm happy to address that in the questions. But we also, and perhaps now more importantly, and by the way, I should have mentioned that the issue of how we discount the future is really central to the most cited study on the economics of climate change, led by Nicholas Stern in the UK, in which the choice of a discount rate for future generations is crucial to whether one takes action or not. We also discount the interests of others. We're not yet in the situation where the person next to us on a flight from the US to Japan or China is talking on a phone the whole time, but you can imagine um, how annoying that would be. How do we protect ourselves, others, and future generations against the consequences of our overuse of our resources? Coming back to the question I raised at the beginning and promised to revisit, can cooperation be extended to the global level? How do we get there? We have to get there. Well, Lynn Ostrom, in some of her last work, talked about what she called a polycentric approach, building on work that she and her husband, Vincent Ostrom, had been doing for years. The idea was that getting 200 countries to cooperate all at once was going to be nearly impossible, and therefore we should build local agreements, which could mean the U.S. and China, small agreements that would be building blocks, springboards for broader agreements. So, with Avinash Dixit and my former student Andrew Tillman, we've done a lot of work on how one gets contributions to public goods and common pool resources in structured populations in which individuals are more likely to be pro-social towards individuals within their own group. They care about the local effects, but because of the interconnectedness of systems, the spillover of epidemics, for example, the spillover of pollution, and that one might get international agreement. So how do we reach this? Happy to send these papers to anyone, but they're papers in which we take a game theoretic approach in which individuals can contribute to a public good or retain the benefits for themselves. They derive benefits from the public good, but the challenge is to push them towards the cooperative equilibrium that benefits everyone. Not just individuals, but we can apply this at the next highest level to nations. Nations belong to international organizations like NATO or the United Nations, or the Council of Europe, or the WHO, and they don't belong to just one. They belong to multiple overlapping agreements. So with my former postdoc, Vitor Vasconcelos, and student Phil Hannum and colleague George Pacheco, we've published a series of papers in which nations enter into agreements based upon the linkages of the sort you saw in the previous slide, and we show that the multiple overlapping memberships actually has the potential to facilitate agreement on issues like climate change. So again, happy to send these papers to anyone. I'm not going to take you through the mathematics today. I'll just give you a little idea of how we've extended these ideas to deal with decarbonization with Vitor and Elke Weber and Sarah Constantino. We've been part of a project at Princeton about decarbonization and how we could get decarbonization accepted, focusing on China, on India, and on the United States. And the idea here is that individuals have attitudes and opinions, but the individuals belong to groups, which could be the political parties that you saw earlier, and those groups have attitudes and opinions on particular issues. We represent this as a bit string. Individuals interact with other individuals on a network, and they change their opinions and their attitudes based on what others tell them, based on what their groups tell them. And on longer time scales, the groups may change their positions, or individuals may change memberships in the groups. So this is our approach to these problems. So let me conclude with a few comments. I'm an ecologist, and ecology really began from natural history with people like those that you see here. And natural history is still the foundation of ecology. But it was recognized early on that understanding ecological patterns and ecological interactions meant understanding dynamics, like the famous interaction between the hare and the lynx in the Arctic, and also Vito Volterra's famous work on the Adriatic fisheries. Understanding the fluctuations of them meant that mathematical models were necessary. So although it began with biology, it quickly developed interactions with mathematics. Mathematical ecology is a century old. And then later with physics, with chemistry, and with engineering. More recently with genomics. And to some small extent with the social sciences and the humanities. But neglect of this area has been why we haven't made more progress. So the take-home lesson from my lecture today is that ecology has to build stronger links with the social sciences and with humanities, issues of ethics and the like. The National Science Foundation recognized this some years ago with something called CHANS, a coupled human and natural systems, and now this is CHANS 2.0, called the Dynamics of Integrated Socio-Environmental Systems. which is a major commitment of the National Science Foundation, in which the interactions between Earth systems and human systems are explored. Universities like Princeton and University of Texas at Arlington need to begin to make these couplings and to enhance collaboration across disciplines. Developing an integrated study of Earth-human systems, crossing scales and crossing disciplines, built on disciplines, but reaching from the basics to policy and back. We've been working hard to do that. I was the founding director of something called the Princeton Environmental Institute. It's now called the High Meadows Environmental Institute. And Professor Nygren has been leading an effort at UTA to make similar connections. It's very difficult. Universities are founded on disciplines, and those disciplines are crucial to providing the strength that's the foundation. But facilitating these linkages, and not just the linkages we're used to between physics and chemistry, or even physics and biology, but reaching out to the social sciences, including especially economics, but not just economics, and to ethics and the humanities and English. There are few departments, if any, that should not be involved in these efforts. So let me conclude. Public goods and common pool resource problems represent fundamental challenges in economics and in evolutionary biology. I've tried to convince you that collective action can emerge from local interactions, although top-down influences can be important. And problems play out on multiple scales. The collective decisions from the bottom up can impose what Hardin was talking about in terms of mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And I think linking these is key to what we need to do. It's key to understanding the management of the commons. So finally, the question I've raised for you now 4 times, can cooperation be extended to the global level? I have to believe the answer to that is yes, but it won't be easy, because historically the emergence of cooperation within groups has been to a large extent for the benefit of conflict with other groups. But we have to collectively recognize that we have to rise above that. In the global commons, there is no other group. Many of you will remember the comic strip Pogo, in which his friend says it's hard walking on this stuff, and he says, "Yep, son, we have met the enemy, and he is us." Understanding how to achieve international cooperation, I think, is at the core of achieving sustainability and dealing with our common enemy, environmental degradation. And it's the only pathway by which we can achieve a sustainable future for our children and for our grandchildren. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take any sorts of questions now.
Simon, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I think we're all going to be thinking about the content for a long time to come. I personally think you really hit the nail on the head, and lots of hands are clapping. Now, for questions, I failed to announce that you could put them in chat, so let's not do that. Kevin, maybe you could put up a gallery view so that I could maybe call on people to ask questions. Would that be possible, Kevin?
If I can't put a gallery view, but if someone has a question and raises their hand, we could recognize them.
Okay. I can't see everybody on this particular view is my problem. So let us try to proceed. Let me ask the first question then, while we are all thinking about how to proceed here. Simon, what do you think the role is that we could do individually or semi-collectively and make the most impact right away? Is there something that stands out?
Well, I do think we have to proceed from the bottom up. I've been in constant communication with a somewhat more conservative friend of mine, who nonetheless shares the same objectives in terms of vaccination. So let's focus on that problem for a while. She says that her hello.
Go on. Yes.
Yeah, she says that her neighbors initially were got the first shot, but are not going to get the second shot. So I think we have to begin by talking by bottom up information campaigns in which we educate others and respect respect their hesitations, but try to teach them, try to convince them of what's going on. Ultimately, we have to convince politicians, and we have to convince politicians of the benefits of international agreements. We've seen it happen, and I think we need to study how it was that we've achieved some of these changes. But I think in all cases in the U.S. that I can think of, it was because there was public pressure to change that. We've been successful in addressing some questions, some issues, and less successful in others. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think I ran a series of meetings last year. We have a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy coming out on the dynamics of political polarization. I think the political polarization, not only in our country but in the world, is at the highest level in my lifetime, and it stands in the way of achieving it. You saw your fellow Texan, former President Bush, who came out and said something basically to that effect the other day. We've got to find ways to break down the political polarization that's going on and look for collective solutions that benefit everyone. We're on the wrong side of the coordination game. Now we've got to get to the good solution.
Thank you, Simon. Let me call on Sophia Pesci next, and you can unmute yourself.
Yes. Thank you very much, Levin. That was an illuminating talk. And also, I want to mention that I have followed your research for years and have introduced it to my classes, and it's a real honor to be with us here. So I have a question about whether selfishness versus cooperation depends on scale. For example, the classical prisoner dilemma, it pertains to two prisoners, but if we expand for larger groups, wouldn't we expect cooperation to be more beneficial than selfishness? So that's my first question about whether it depends on scale. And my second question is if now there are different predicted shared socioeconomic pathways. Some of them predict greater globalization, others greater, more nationalistic approaches. So this different geopolitics, how do you expect to affect cooperation?
Okay, those are great questions. So first of all, unquestionably, the role of cooperation depends on scale, but I'm afraid not in the way you might think. By the way, mathematically, there's been the emergence in the last decade of a subject called mean field games, which deals with cooperation of large numbers of agents. And the reason I say not in the way you might think, or at least hope, is because it's the larger assemblages in which cooperation is more difficult to achieve. In a pairwise situation, prisoner's dilemma is a very special kind of situation because the players are isolated from each other and not able to communicate. But reciprocal altruism can be a mechanism by which cooperation is achieved. The late catcher and manager Yogi Berra supposedly said, "If you don't go to other people's funerals, they won't come to yours." But the idea is that's an indirect altruism in which if you have a small group, in fact, my book begins from that theme, which is in that small societies cooperate, and that's Lynn Ostrom's work too. Cooperation's more easily achieved. I think the real challenge is how we get cooperation in large groups. And Lynn's point was, well, because it works better in small groups, we should build cooperative units that will then basically become bargaining agents with other units. And that's the only way you're going to get there. To your second point, unquestionably, I think the increasing trend towards nationalism makes things much harder. Obviously, it's reduced. It's reduced the prosociality and the caring about others, it's what I meant by my answer on political polarization. Until we can overcome that, and this is a pendulum, I hope, because we have swung here before towards these nationalist tendencies. We've got to move back from that, and so I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. It does.
Thank you for the questions. Great question.
Now there's another question from Alex, if you want to pose your question by unmuting yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very thought-provoking talk and a beautiful talk. Thank you. So I remember Milton Friedman said that money was a way to get people from all over the globe to cooperate without coercion. And we had this idea of cap and trade to build the, I guess, the real costs of the pollution into the economic picture. Is there any hope for that kind of solution, an economic solution? Well,
of course, don't you think that money is a kind of vehicle of coercion? But I don't see that as a drawback. When we approach any of these problems, like this was our approach to the problem of the herdsman, we ask first, what's the social optimum? We can compute that. That's an optimization problem. But then we say, suppose there's no top-down influence. Is this a Nash equilibrium? So from an economic sense, will this work? If not, are there so-called second best solutions that maybe are not as good as the social optimum by which we can achieve it? And those might involve some monetary transfers, some side payments, for example. Certainly, if we're going to get these agreements, there are lots of the models treat all of the agents as identical. And of course, they're not. And that's got to be taken into account. And they're going to involve payments, side payments, perhaps from the richer countries to the poorer countries. I'm hopeful that some of those things can be achieved. I don't have a specific view on cap and trade, and which can be a somewhat controversial topic. And the similar sorts of ideas come up in fisheries management in terms of if I've got certain rights, should I be able to sell them to others and things of that sort. But I think I don't agree with all or even most of what Milton Friedman said, but I think money is the key, and it will involve some sort of side payments to bring others in. There are some famous examples of like Tom Lovejoy's so-called debt for nature swaps, in which countries like the U.S. or institutions within countries like the U.S. went into places like Brazil and bought up their debt on condition that they preserve the natural areas. So there are ways to do this.
I see no other hands at this point, but the hour, I think, is nearly up. On behalf of the entire College of Science. Let me thank you, Simon, for a wonderful afternoon and a very thought-provoking talk. And I think that
David, there are a
concludes.
couple of, sorry, David, there are a couple of questions in the chat window.
There you are. Okay. I didn't see the hand up. I'm sorry. This is Neela. Go ahead, Neela.
Oh, the question is, well, first of all, Simon, really thank you. It's really a wonderful talk. Gives us thinking point to all of us. So my question basically is, what role can universities and academia in general play for the collective good of climate change situation? What, like in your opinion, how can we collaborate or make collective efforts,
Well, of course,
starting from the university level?
yeah, universities can do a variety of things. First of all, obviously, the place to start, I think, is providing education on these issues for students, and much of that is going to rely upon cross-disciplinary programs like the one that David is trying to develop, both at the undergraduate and at the graduate level. It's got to find ways to encourage departments to work together. I'm not going to single out particular departments, but some departments have been traditionally much more naturally involved in these. I'm in an ecology department, which is by nature one that reaches out and for interactions with other departments. Some of the purer departments, well, maybe I do have to mention department. I mean, it's been a real challenge in most institutions to get frontline economists involved in addressing these sorts of problems, because they're seen as applications of traditional methods rather than the development of new ideas and methods. So the university has to find ways to break. I'm certainly not arguing for the elimination of departments. When I founded the institute here, I deliberately said I didn't want a separate school. I wanted joint appointments with departments. And so in order to try to involve the departments and not compete with them. And of course, the university can do, can to whatever extent, should develop outreach, but also should look to their own activities, to their own pollution levels, and to their investments, and to try to be good citizens in that sense as well. So I've tried to cover the spectrum there.
Yes. Yes, it's very complicated.
It is, yeah. Well, thank you for your point.
Yes, I'm afraid it's now an hour, and I have to apologize to Fajer and possibly others who might like to have some time, but I think we have to finish now. And thank you once again, Simon, for a lovely afternoon.